When it comes to the United Nations Sustainability Agenda, they have two primary goals, and the goals are very well thought out. First of all, the primary goal is eliminating poverty. According to the UN Sustainability Agenda, their 2030 Sustainability Agenda, the quote is, "Eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge." And that's important to consider when we talk about sustainability. The second UN goal is eradicating hunger. According to the UN document, quote, "We resolve between now and 2030 to end poverty and hunger everywhere." Everything else that we talk about, everything else that will be talked about at this UN conference is subservient to these first two goals. These are the most important goals. These are the ones that have the most significant impact on people, and especially people who are living in poverty, people who need some escape from a very dire current condition. So that being the case, we need to find out what is the best means to eradicate poverty, and what are the best means to eradicate hunger. Just because the United Nations has a goal of eradicating poverty doesn't mean that their particular solutions are the best ones. Well, it's important to keep in mind that energy is the lifeblood of the economy, and that's true in the United States and throughout the world. When the price of energy rises, the price of all goods and services rise as well. That means people have less money available to buy the necessary goods and services that make lives longer, healthier, and more enjoyable. This would include money for nutrition, money for education, money for housing, money for goods and services, money for healthcare services, anything that makes life more enjoyable, and more than more enjoyable, but healthier and longer lasting. So here we have a chart. What I've done is I've taken information from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and also from the US Energy Information Administration. And this shows how important the price of energy is to economic well-being. The blue line is the price of oil per barrel in inflation-adjusted dollars, and the orange line is the unemployment rate. And what you see is that every time there is an increase in the price of oil, immediately thereafter we see a corresponding increase in the unemployment rate. Every time we see a decrease in the price of oil, we see a decrease in the unemployment rate. And this has held true now for more than 40 years. In fact, if we go back a decade ago, the last Great Recession, many people think that the reason for the Great Recession was either the housing bubble or the Wall Street financial crisis, but those were mere symptoms. If you recall the summer of drill baby drill, that was in 2007, 2008, what we see here is that oil prices were going up in that time period dramatically. That's why people were saying drill baby drill. And it was only after oil prices went up, but pretty much immediately thereafter, that unemployment went up as well. And you can see that in the chart. This is the case not just in the United States, but globally. Energy availability and energy affordability is crucial to economic well-being. And again, it's not just about greed, it's not just about dollars and cents, it's about people having the ability to purchase, to obtain the goods and services that make their lives happier, healthier, longer lasting. Now, there's a reason why people around the world choose conventional energy sources. It's not just the United States. Some people would lead you to believe that because of outsized corporate power or influence in the United States or our political system, that's why conventional energy wins out, and that's why we have so little wind and solar power on the conventional or on the electricity grid. But I'd like you to take a look at the chart. On the right-hand side, we have energy consumption throughout the world. And what you see going back to 1965, the blue line is oil, the black line is coal, the purple line is natural gas. These dominate energy usage, have done so for 50 years and continue to do so. The green line is renewables, and we see a modest increase during recent years, but again, the percentage is exceedingly small. This is not just the United States, this is globally. There's not a grand conspiracy where every nation's government in the entire world is selling out or being corrupted by some corporate influences. The reason is that these energy sources are more affordable and less expensive. They allow people better access to goods and services to improve their lives. On the left, what we see is data regarding electricity generation. So we're taking out the transportation realm of what we saw on the right, and we're just looking at electricity generation, because this is what wind and solar power affect. Again, globally, what we see, this is for 2014, this is the last year for which we have data. We have coal power producing 41%, natural gas 22%, hydropower 16%, nuclear power 11%, and renewables constitute only 6% of the global electricity mix. There's a reason for this. It's because they're much more expensive. The economies of the world, the governments of the world, they are going to be focusing on what energy sources are most available at the best price. Tangibly, we can see the results here in the United States. This study is a picture of the opening cover for a study produced by the Brookings Institution. The Brookings Institution is a left-of-center public policy organization. They are generally favorable to renewable power. And yet, when they were looking at this issue honestly, what they found, as the title of their study states, why the best path to a low-carbon future is not wind or solar power. And the reason the title says that is because their study found that if you replace conventional power, primarily coal power, if you replace conventional power with new wind facilities, you're going to double electricity prices. If you replace conventional energy, if you replace existing plants with new solar plants, then what you're seeing is a quadrupling of energy prices. Even from people who are cheerleaders of renewable energy, they understand that replacing conventional energy with wind or solar power dramatically increases prices. Now, that study was produced in 2014, so you may say, well, the price of wind and solar, we're constantly told how the prices have gone down. Well, let's take a look at that. First of all, here's a chart from the Brookings Institution study itself documenting those numbers. But now this slide, this is a study from this year, June of 2019. The Institute for Energy Research took a look at the same factors. And they found essentially the same thing, because although the price of wind and solar has gone down, so too has the price of conventional energy. And the price of wind and solar was so high that even if prices go down, they still remain much higher than conventional energy. So what we see in the chart, the top line, you see conventional coal. Beneath that, you see conventional combined gas cycle, then nuclear power, hydropower. And the bottom two are wind power and solar power. The lightly shaded top bar in each of those graphs is the cost of existing sources for each of those. So the cost of existing coal power plants, you see at the top. And then beneath that, under conventional coal, you see the cost of if we built one from scratch. So replacing existing coal power plants, and by the way, that's where the advocacy is going, to shut down perfectly operational coal power plants and replace with new wind and solar facilities. What this study shows is that even in 2019, replacing coal power with new wind power or new solar power more than doubles electricity prices. That has a tremendous impact on people's standard of living. In fact, if we were to build from scratch, even if these power plants had to be shut down anyway, it would still be more cost efficient, would save people money, would raise living standards if we built new coal plants, new natural gas plants, new nuclear plants, or new hydro facilities as opposed to wind and solar. Now, that's the case in the United States, and that's the case globally. That's why globally conventional energy sources dominate electricity production and consumption. And it's a good thing. It allows people to escape poverty. A short little case in point before we move on, Bernie Sanders has, just in the past week as we present this conference, he's issued his own Green New Deal plan. Now, his plan, by his own words, would cost $16.3 trillion. The chart says 16.9, it's actually 16.3. And that's, of course, if everything comes in according to cost, which is rarely the case with big government programs. But regardless, $16.3 trillion. If you divide that among America's 120 million households, because trillions of dollars, people's eyes glaze over. It's easy to say, well, it's just a lot of money, but who knows? Divided among America's households, it amounts to almost $150,000 per household. If we were to enact Bernie Sanders' plan, that's what your household's on the hook for. Can you afford it? Is it worth it? $150,000. And it's not saying, well, then you get free energy. Not at all, because you still have to purchase your wind and solar power on top of that. Moreover, even environmental activists, even the environmental left, realize there are negative environmental consequences from wind and solar power, such as the death of birds, the death of bats, developing pristine lands to put this equipment on. Even they realize that even wind and solar power has a negative footprint, so they will look to minimize use as well. So they're going to look to keep prices high, just it's going to be high prices for wind and solar. The point is this, $150,000 upfront, and then you're still paying your electricity prices. That is an amount that is entirely economically unsustainable here in the United States and anywhere else in the world. Moreover, looking at the socialist agenda behind Bernie Sanders' platform and many people who are advocating the Green New Deal, that's just one of their many agendas and platforms with such high costs. If we're going to replace our free market healthcare system, well, it's no longer a free market, but if we're to replace our private free market health system with government-provided healthcare, well, that's a tremendous increase in fees as well. Also, if we're looking at college education for all, again, how many times are we going to foist on $150,000, $100,000, $200,000 to your tax burden? The point is this: renewable energy comes at a tremendous cost, and going 100% green, like the environmental left advocates, will bankrupt you and will sentence more people, not less people, to poverty. UN goal number 1, eradicating poverty. The way to get there is to encourage affordable energy, not wind and solar power. The second UN goal is eradicating hunger, another noble and worthy cause, and something we should be working toward. So just this past month, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report in which it contained all sorts of doom and gloom scenarios, claiming that global warming is decimating global crop production. Here on this slide, you see the headlines from some of the media sources regarding this topic. So we see CNN, we see the New York Times, we see United Press International, as well as Rolling Stone. These are the headlines for their articles. All of them say essentially the same: global climate change is causing a food collapse or something thereabouts. But let's take a look at the real data. Actually, let's get one more quote from the study itself. The IPCC study says climate change, including increases in frequency and intensity of extremes, has already impacted food security and terrestrial ecosystems, as well as contributed to desertification and land degradation in many regions. And the key word there is already. It's already impacting food security, desertification, land degradation. So if that's already the case, then we can test those against real-world data. So let's take a look and see what the data show us. Now here on the right, you see a chart. This is a chart from the United Nations itself, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And what it shows is that from 2009 up through the present, we've seen a significant increase in global crop production. You see on the title, it's cereal production, which is the big three. This is corn, wheat, and rice. These are the staple crops that the UN tracks. And what we see is a dramatic increase in crop production. Just in the past decade, we've seen a significant increase along the lines of approximately 20%. Now, this defies what the United Nations has previously claimed. The report, of course, this month claiming we're already seeing the impacts and claiming we'll keep seeing the impacts. But in 1990, the United Nations said patterns of agricultural trade could be altered by decreased cereal production in some of the currently high production areas. Well, 30 years later, that hasn't happened. 30 years later, we're still seeing increasing crop production. In 2015, the United Nations claimed, quote, climate-related impacts are already reducing crop yields in some parts of the world. Well, the some parts of the world must be pretty small because what we see is a significant increase in crop production. Now, you may be saying, well, James, that's from 2009. What happened before that? Are you hiding anything? Well, actually, no. Here is data regarding corn, wheat, rice, and we're adding on vegetables and fruit. These data are provided by GeoHive, but again, it's using United Nations food and agriculture data. What you see is if we go back to 1970, we can go back still further. Corn, wheat, rice, fruits, vegetables, yields are increasing significantly with new records being set nearly every year. So we have on the one hand claims that global warming is decimating crop production, but we see actual real-world data from the United Nations itself that as our world continues its modest warming, crop yields are increasing year by year throughout the world. And the news just keeps getting better because the data I presented ended in 2018, but we have good news for this year as well. According to Grain Central, which is an agricultural publication, citing the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we're expecting a global record in wheat production this year. And that prediction is seconded by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. On the one hand, their climate group says we're seeing global warming decimating crop production. On the other hand, UN reports record wheat output this year. It's not just wheat. World rice production, according to the UN itself, world rice production will match last year's record for most production and yields per hectare. In other words, it's not just that we're producing food from more areas of land, but the yields per unit of land are increasing and setting records every single year. It's not just wheat and it's not just rice. Here we have total cereal production. Again, the United Nations itself predicting a record in 2019 for world cereal output. How can it be that global warming is decimating food output, crop outputs, when the data themselves presented by the United Nations show we're setting new records every year? The facts rebut and contradict the alarmist assertions. Now, going beyond their global predictions and claims, the United Nations singles out a few places where they say the effects are particularly noteworthy. So here's a quote from the IPCC report saying, warming compounded by drying has caused yield declines in parts of southern Europe. Okay, well, let's test that, because the United Nations not only produces global crop production statistics, but they also compile data on regions and individual nations. So let's take a look at Italy. We're talking southern Europe. Here we see, going back to 1961, we see dramatic, consistent increases in crop yields in Italy. New records being set virtually every year. Greece, we see the same pattern, consistent increase in crop production in the long term, in the midterm, and in the short term. Spain, the same thing. So I don't know what areas, what portions of southern Europe the United Nations is talking about, but in the three largest nations in Central Europe, Italy, Greece, and Spain, we see dramatic increases in crop production. And if there are some isolated areas that the UN doesn't specify where perhaps we may see a decline in crop output, it's hard to blame it on global warming when the entire region is experiencing increasing crop productions. But it's not just the entire region, it's the whole globe, as the data showed. Now, the United Nations also claimed in their report, based on indigenous and local knowledge, climate change is affecting food security in dry lands, particularly those in Africa, and high mountain regions in Asia and South America. Well, I don't have access to indigenous or local knowledge, but I do have access to the United Nations' own compiled statistics for nations in Africa, Asia, and South America. So let's take a look. Drylands in Africa. So let's start with some of the drier nations in Africa. Here, crop yields in Egypt. What we see is a consistent long-term, mid-term, short-term increase in crop production. Burkina Faso, just south of the Sahara Desert. Again, we see the same thing. New records being set almost every year. Long-term increases in crop production. Ethiopia, again, unmistakable, clear trend of increasing crop production. Where are the regions, the dry regions in Africa, where crop production is falling? How about Chad? Al Gore highlighted Chad in his movie An Inconvenient Truth, claiming that desertification and drought was impacting Chad. Well, if it is, it's certainly not impacting crop production. We see here, again, a long-term, mid-term, short-term increase in crop production, setting records consistently. Other large African nations, Nigeria, the same pattern. South Africa, the same pattern, even more so. Throughout Africa, what we see is that as our world modestly warms, crop production, yields per acre, yields per hectare, are increasing consistently, and they continue to do so. There is absolutely no evidence that global warming is decimating food production. It's just the opposite. Now, the United Nations also mentioned areas in Asia, so let's take a look at that. Here's production in China, very large, important crop-producing nation in Asia. What we see is a sustained long-term increase in crop production. India, the same thing. Pakistan, we're talking dry lands, as the United Nations did the same thing. Russia, the same thing. Nation after nation after nation, not only globally, but in the specific areas the United Nations highlights, we see dramatic increases in crop production. Here's Turkey, the same thing. Now, it's interesting, many of the alarmists claim that a drought caused by climate change in Syria is responsible for all the political unrest in that country. The Arab Spring, which, by the way, in which people rose up against a dictator, which is not necessarily a bad thing, although if you listen to climate alarmists, it is, was caused by global warming, they said. Well, the Arab Spring occurred in 2004. Do you see anything here that's going on that shows that Syrian crop production plummeted and was disastrous in 2004? No, you don't. What you see is that crop production in Syria has consistently increased over the past few decades. If climate change is impacting Syria, it's doing it for the better. And in fact, if global warming, if climate change is responsible for anything that might have happened in Syria, it should have also affected Syria's neighbors. So let's take a look at the neighboring countries. Here's crop production in Israel. Again, long-term dramatic increases. Iraq, the same thing. Jordan, the same thing. Lebanon, the same thing. Saudi Arabia, the same thing. So here we have another region specifically highlighted by the United Nations. Rather than global warming decimating food production and crop output, we see records being set each and every year. If there's a crisis at all, it's a crisis of too much food, which I don't think many people consider a crisis. Here's Iran as well. We see the same thing throughout the Middle East and throughout Asia. The United Nations report highlighted South America as well. South America, the results are even more dramatic. Take a look at this. Here we have crop production in Chile. We're talking drier areas and we're talking highlands. Okay, here we have Chile. We're seeing a dramatic increase in crop production. Uruguay, same thing, record production. Paraguay, new record set almost every year. Ecuador, the same thing. Peru, the same thing. Argentina, the same thing. Brazil, the same thing. Folks, what's it going to take for the United Nations to tell us the truth? What's it going to take for them to stop peddling alarmism and look at their own data? By every measure conceivable in virtually every nation in the world, and certainly in the world as a whole, we see as temperatures warm, crop production sets new records virtually each and every year. There is no global warming, crop, or food crisis. Now here, these are data, again, supplied by the United Nations. This is about the status of hunger in the world. So just in the past 17 years, from 2000 to 2017, according to the United Nations' most recent report, we see a dramatic decline in hunger. And that is directly correlated with the increase in global crop production. It doesn't mean that we should rest on our laurels, and it doesn't mean that we don't have much more work to do. But if we're going to talk about climate change in relation to food production and global hunger and eradicating hunger, what we see that as our planet continues its modest warming, we see the benefits that are occurring and getting better year after year. The UN report also, as I mentioned, as I read off from their quoted report, mentioned desertification, claiming that global warming is causing an expansion of deserts. Well, that's simply not the case. Just like the crop prediction claims are falsified by real data, so are the desertification claims. This is a chart. This was produced by instruments aboard NASA satellites, satellite imagery for the Earth, and it was published in the peer-reviewed geophysical research letters. And satellite instruments were able to measure the density of global foliage. And what they measured is that there's been a significant increase in the density and the reach of global foliage. Now, the satellite instruments went into place in 1982. This study was published in 2013, where they examined the 30 years of trends. And what they found is not only is there a significant increase in global foliage, but it's especially strong in the arid regions that are subject to desertification. Look, for example, at the Sahara Desert. Look at the southern edge of it, where you see the green and especially the dark blue. That's an area of especially strong foliage growth. This is where grasslands are taking up residence where it used to be desert. Now, a quote from the study, after they looked at the results, they said, "We predict that the 14% increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide from 1982 to 2010 led to a 5 to 10% increase in green foliage cover in warm, arid environments." Again, that explicitly contradicts the United Nations alarmist claims. It tells us we shouldn't believe what the United Nations tells us. We should believe what the evidence shows us. Also in the UN report, there's an assertion that we're seeing a decrease in the nutrients in crops. This is something that climate alarmists frequently say to me when I present the crop data. Usually they accuse me of making it up. If I show them the data, then they say, well, but the studies show that they're less nutritious. Well, this is from the IPCC report issued this past month. It says that with more atmospheric carbon dioxide, they project that there will be lower nutritional quality when we get to 546 to 586 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And essentially what they're projecting, again, this is not a measurement, this is an estimate, that we'll see roughly 5 to 10% less protein, zinc, or iron at those levels. Well, a few things to keep in mind. First of all, those are just projections, they're not measurements. Second of all, getting to 546 to 586 parts per million, that's not going to happen until about the year 2100, and that's assuming we continue to increase carbon dioxide at its present rate, which is debatable. But let's say it happens. So we have a dramatic long-term increase in crop output. The greatest problem, the greatest pressure facing people in this world who are starving, it's not micronutrients, it's calories, it's food availability. So what we have is 99 parts of good news where we're able to grow many more crops, and perhaps 1% of speculative bad news that there might be, well, maybe 5 or 10% less nutritious in a few micronutrients. Well, I think the benefits far outweigh the forecast harms. And even then, it's important to remember that we can mitigate these also, because the whole theory is that, look, the soil contains only so many nutrients. And if we're producing more food from the same amount of soil, well, then there's going to be less of those nutrients per unit of food. Okay, perhaps that's the case. But if we put fertilizer in the soil, problem solved. People can take vitamin supplements, which are much more affordable and easily accessible than whole diets to bring people out of starvation. The point is this: food production is growing dramatically. It's unmistakable, it's irrefutable. Speculation about a minor decrease in nutrients pales in comparison to the benefits of people having access to tremendously more food supplies. Another asserted crisis. It's been frequently asserted that because of global warming, we're seeing drought and crop failures in Central America, and particularly the two nations that we are told most of the migrants, or the lion's share of migrants, come from, Honduras and Guatemala. Here's an article on NBC News on their website just last month, July 9th, 2019. The title and subtitle are Central America's Choice: Pray for Rain or Migrate. Ravaged by drought, farmers in rural Honduras and Guatemala live on the edge of hunger. Now, the article makes the case that because global warming is decimating their crops, they can't feed themselves. They have no choice but to come here. If people are concerned about people from Central America entering this country without legal authority, well, then we should be addressing global warming. That's the messaging. But let's take a look. Here they are specifically referencing Honduras and Guatemala, and of course the whole Central American region is what we're talking about. Now, is Central America any different from South America or Asia or Africa or the world as a whole? If it is, it's hard to say it's global warming, but let's take a look and see. Again, the United Nations' own data. Crop output in Guatemala, long-term increase. That increase is continuing. We've seen increases in crop production each of the past several years. Honduras, the other nation that was specifically referenced in the NBC News article. Again, we see a long-term, mid-term, and short-term increase in crop production. It defies common sense, it defies objective evidence to claim that we're having immigrants flood our southern borders because of a global warming-induced crop crisis chasing farmers off their fields. No, conditions have never been better for crop production in Guatemala and Honduras. It's not just those two nations either. Here's Nicaragua, same thing. Costa Rica, same thing. Panama, same thing. Any way you cut it, in areas where we're seeing migrants, if we're having any climate impact on crop production and people able to feed themselves, it is that as our planet modestly warms, crop production is easier, people have more and better access to food, and that would alleviate any pressures that food production would have on immigration. And again, here you have Mexico as well, the same thing. As the earth warms, food is more abundant rather than more scarce. Which brings us back to the whole point of the United Nations Conference. Yes, we share the same noble goals. And yes, we want to reach them, eradicating poverty, eradicating hunger. But how we get there is important. You know, the United Nations, they talk about, here are some quotes from their sustainability agenda. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. We're determined to taking urgent action on climate change. Well, what we see is that climate change has improved the human condition. It's improved crop output. It's improved the greening of the earth. And let's look at one more factor. This is from The Lancet. It's a peer-reviewed medical journal, probably the most prestigious peer-reviewed medical journal in the world. A study there in 2015 examined deaths, and what they determined was that 7% of all deaths in the world are caused by temperatures that are less than ideal. Now that sounds alarming. That is an area of concern. But here's the key. What they found is that cold temperatures kill 20 times more people than warm or hot temperatures. It's not global warming that's killing people. It's a lack of global warming that's killing people. 4 million people die each year because temperatures are not optimal and they are too cold. If the earth continues to warm at its modest pace, we're going to see an alleviation of that cold. And it's not some occasional cold snap that the alarmists blame on global warming. What the study found is that long-term, persistently, moderately cold temperatures are what result in the vast majority of those 4 million people who die each year as a result of cold temperatures. 20 times more than warm or hot temperatures. Global warming is saving lives. Let me finish just by talking about what we can do together. It is noble that the United Nations understands that alleviating poverty is the first and foremost concern in any sustainability agenda. It is noble as well as notable that the United Nations states that ending hunger is the second most important goal. Everything else that's discussed at this conference is subservient to ending poverty and ending hunger. And what we know when we look at the facts, the United Nations may be pushing a socialist collectivist agenda that restricts energy use, that restricts conventional energy in particular, and seeks to restrict global warming by imposing all sorts of impositions on our energy sources. But the fact of the matter is, the best way to eradicate poverty is to have affordable, abundant energy. And that's by utilizing more of our conventional energy sources, not less. The best way to end hunger is to see the consistent improvement in crop output that we're seeing now as temperatures warm. As temperatures warm, we see longer growing seasons, fewer frost events. We see more ideal crop conditions. So we agree with the United Nations. Yes, let's eradicate poverty. Yes, let's eradicate hunger. And the best way to do it is not through getting rid of our most abundant, affordable energy sources. It's by encouraging them. Thank you very much.